I will simply now pass over to Woody. Thank you all for being here, and thank him for the new edition. And of course, to mention his co-editor, Patricia Bromley. Welcome, Woody.
Thank you, Stefan. And thank you to the Marshall and the LSE for organizing this discussion. I figured we'd do it in kind of three short parts. I'll talk a bit about the three editions of the handbook and how the field has evolved over roughly a 40-year period. I'll then very briefly talk about a chapter called Seeing Like a Philanthropist, which is a political history of philanthropy. And then I'll turn to Maitreesh to give an overview of his chapter. Maybe I should start by saying that what's exciting about this edition is that it's all almost entirely fresh faces. I'm one of the few that is in all three editions. The only other person is Helmut Anheier in Berlin at the Hertie School, and Helmut's there by virtue of having been my first graduate student. So we have entirely new authors and new perspectives on the nonprofit sector, and I think the volume reflects this kind of new vision. The handbook first began as an effort back in the 1980s to try to map what the nonprofit sector was. At the time, I was at Yale University in sociology and management, but also affiliated with their program on nonprofit organizations. And that group was very much trying to figure out what is the economic role of nonprofit organizations. This was in the wake of something called the Filer Commission in the US. And for the first time, people thought of soup kitchens, art museums, soccer clubs, private universities, and foundations as part of a common field. And yet no one knew how much they employed, how many people they employed, what their contribution to GDP was. So in that sense, this early edition was a mapping exercise. And there are a couple of key chapters in it. People in the UK will smile. There was a political theory of the nonprofit sector written by James Douglas, or as he liked to go by, Mr. Mary Douglas. James was a consultant to the Tory party in England and very much trying to figure out what a quango was and how did a quango relate to an MPO. And so there are a lot of definitional issues in that first volume. The second edition reflected a growing interest in nonprofits, primarily, I won't want to say exclusively, by a variety of people in both economics departments and in management schools. So the second edition focused on this growing importance of fee for services and the pressure for nonprofits to become more managerial, to become more professional. And I did that edition with Richard Steinberg, who is an economist. And so this question of earned income and what happens to mission or what happens to altruism and what happens to purpose when financial survival is at stake was kind of a theme that ran through the volume. And the second edition had what we might call a functional orientation. So it ran through different sectors of the economy and society: education, social services, the arts, religion, and the like, and ask questions like, what is the size of the nonprofit portion of that part of the economy? So, in higher education in the US, private universities represent about 75% of all universities, but only about 25% of students. And so you start seeing that public universities are these multi-purpose organizations, and private universities, nonprofit universities, are much more specialized ones. So with this current edition, we felt like the field had changed in some dramatic ways, both in terms of the landscape of the planet, but also in terms of scholarship. So I worked on this edition with Patricia Bromley. She's a comparativist. She works in the field of international education. And so this volume has a much stronger global orientation. There are many more chapters that think about the role of nonprofits around the world, how they might serve different purposes. There's a lot of talk. I'm actually currently working on this in a project on the civic life of cities of what is the role of nonprofits in autocratic societies such as China, or more struggling for the right word, countries like Singapore, where one party rule tends to characterize it. We're also mindful of how much the spread of nonprofits has in some places eroded the sovereignty of some countries, particularly in the global south, as health policy is dictated by American and British foundations. And so this sort of global focus is certainly an important feature. We also think much more in this current edition about the advocacy side of nonprofits, both nonprofits being involved in advocacy, but also groups using nonprofits to advocate. If you're in the US and you see an environmental group and it says it's an environmental nonprofit, you have to make sure very carefully whether it's actually funded by an oil company or whether it's a citizens group. The author of that chapter in the volume, Ed Walker, has a lovely phrase referring to these faux nonprofits as astroturf organizations, so that the nonprofit form gets used for advocacy purposes. We also think more in this edition about the role of nonprofits in contributing to civic capacity in urban life, and what part of the urban landscape do nonprofits make up, and what role do they play in issues around environmental sustainability. We see in a lot of cities globally that the initial steps to build green buildings actually happens by nonprofits. It's libraries, it's museums. And then they advocate to city governments to pass legislation, which may or may not help speed the move forward. And then corporations get involved, particularly the ones that matter turn out, interestingly, to be chain corporations. So when Starbucks in the US decides to go green, or when a McDonald's chain goes green, it has wide impact. And then suddenly the effort, that the nonprofit began as an accelerator. And so there's a lovely chapter in the handbook that tries to think about this sequence and this combinatorial effect. So in general, we've thought less about the world through functional lens and thought about it more through topical lens. We haven't given up on thinking about healthcare or education or the arts, but the handbook thinks about them through questions of inclusion and access. Who gets to participate in these different kinds of activities? So in many ways, it's a very, very different volume, reflecting the kind of changes in the field as people think more and more about what is the role of nonprofits in the larger society, and do they actually make a difference, okay? And so we also think a lot about the dark side of nonprofits, the extent to which nonprofits may be exclusive, the extent to which they may be places where very non-civil opinion is actually developed. And of course, for me, I had two roles in this volume. One, an introduction that tries to sketch the sort of history and theory of nonprofits, to think hard about what's the relationship between what we call civil society and nonprofit organizations. Why does the meaning of nonprofit differ around the world, and what do we make of this? And how do we even compare such organizations around the world? But I also took on the task with a student of mine, Aaron Horvath, of writing a history of philanthropy. And I think we're at a moment in which the influence of philanthropists has become really quite extraordinary. And in the US, in China, in the UK, increasingly in Europe on the continent, in countries like Brazil, private money is dictating public purpose to a considerable extent. And so we've tried to start thinking about, how do we imagine this? Giving money away binds an institution to a donor's reputation. And philanthropy is a sphere of influence in which definitions of public good are debated. And perhaps it's a place that we go to be our better angels, but it's also a place it's an activity that's not subject to the constraints of public law or the democratic process. And so how do you write a history of philanthropy when you're not a historian? You're a sociologist. So we look for kind of general processes, or if you prefer the term, mechanisms that try to help us understand how philanthropy has evolved over 120 years. Many things have stayed comparable, but a lot of things have changed. And the way we want to think about that is through three sets of ideas. The first is an idea we call transposition. By transposition, I mean the movement of practices, ideas, and people from one domain to an altogether new domain, which alters both that area and has feedback effects back into the domain of origin. And so in philanthropy, what we see is how money was made by the ultra rich conditions in a very powerful way how they spend it. But eventually, how they spend it works back to affect the legitimacy of the organizations where they received it from. If you need a better example of this today, I'll give you two. The first one is, the recent discussion around Michael Bloomberg in the US. Michael Bloomberg gave an extraordinarily generous gift to Johns Hopkins University. And all told, he's given well in excess of $1 billion to a single university. And of course, critics say, to help the causes that he cares about, that money could have been better spent giving it to community colleges and vocational colleges. But Bloomberg said, I'm a graduate of Johns Hopkins. I want it to be an elite university, and I want to fund it to make that possible. But today, the School of Public Health at Hopkins, which is the preeminent school of public health in the US, really in any ratings, it would be at the top of the table, is now called the Bloomberg School of Public Health. And in the US, as we depend daily on our reports on how many new coronavirus cases, hospitalization, and deaths as they are, it always says, brought to you by the Bloomberg School of Public Health, which actually erodes the credibility in the wider public of those very numbers that the school is producing. And so that's the kind of transposition, the movement of practices from the one domain into another, and then the rebound back into the other. Jeff Bezos recently, in the past few years, has committed to giving $2 billion to tackle the problem of homelessness. And of course, the reaction to it has been, that's fantastic, but do we actually need to live in a society where someone can give away $2 billion and in a month's time have already earned that much money back as the stock price of Amazon continues to climb? So this sort of question of transposition is run through the history of philanthropy. A second issue, a second theme that we try to pay attention to is what we call intertwining, the ways in which the past shapes the present, even as the present tries to build the new. And I have a number of examples of that I'll share with you quickly. And then the last point, which I think is underappreciated, is how much different political junctures happen that alter the character and nature of philanthropy in the US, in the UK, even today in China. You see these kinds of changes going on. We make a big point of thinking about the link between the philanthropy of Carnegie and Rockefeller, two philanthropists today. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, they literally were overwhelmed by requests for money. And so they turned the small family offices, often a single person, the family pastor or their personal attorney, to take care of these requests. And similarly, many people on the philanthropy side today express that same question. We are living donors. We're going to live through the consequences of our gifts. How do we think about making these gifts? Early philanthropy was vilified in the U.S. There's a famous U.S. commission, the Walsh Commission, that responded to Rockefeller's request to build a foundation. And it referred to the request as foundations are repugnant to the whole idea of a democratic society. And so early on, foundations had this very considerable challenge of building legitimacy. And these were men in the earliest era of the Gilded Age who'd made their money building railroads, building steel mills. They built brick and mortar. Their philanthropy was overwhelmingly brick and mortar. And they built libraries, universities, museums. But it wasn't lost on critics that access to those types of organizations were limited. And working class people were not able to attend things that were open from 10 to 5 each day, or events, expensive events in the evening. So philanthropy had a hard initial time developing its legitimacy. And through time, you saw some different models develop, different ways of organizing. In 1914, the Cleveland Community Foundation was created with Standard Oil money. And the idea there of Goff, the person who had the money, was to give the money away to the community so the community would decide how to spend the money. A different model happened in 1914 with the Rosenwald Fund. This was Sears Roebuck's money, and it was given to Julian Rosenwald. And the younger son said, I don't want it. I don't want this money. I'm a communist. I'm a socialist. I don't believe in this money. And the lawyer said, sorry, you have to take it. So we set about organizing a very different kind of foundation, a foundation in which it would end within 25 years. And so it would exist not in perpetuity, but with a limited time frame. We've seen today some of the philanthropic couples like Bill and Melinda Gates say their foundation will end 25 years after the two of them pass away. But the difference now is the amount of money associated with the Gates Foundation is so vast and so enormous, there's really no way they can give it away in a 25-year period. And it's quite extraordinary, this transformation. So to respond to this criticism of philanthropy in the early part of the 20th century, you saw people in this field try to build general purpose foundations. They began to talk about addressing root causes, not just charity. And through time, they began to have them professionally staffed. By the 1950s, most people working in philanthropy started to be hired from the likes of us, from the academy and from government. And you suddenly had a philanthropic field in which there were careers, and there was the thought that one could spend one's life in this sector. And the foundations came to resemble the organizations from which they sprung. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in the U.S. If you visit it, as I recall, the first time I went, I couldn't tell where was Johnson & Johnson and where was Robert Wood Johnson. The buildings looked the same. The offices were very similar. Same thing for the Lilly Foundation in Indianapolis. These tended to be rather staid, middle of the road organizations, maybe slightly left-leaning, but not all that left-leaning. But they became under attack by, of all things, a Texas populist named Wright Patman in the US. And Patman passed these tax reform acts aimed at forcing philanthropy to spend their money and spend it more actively. So today we assume that, we have this magic number of a 5% payout from an endowment. It's now being debated in the moment of COVID and the crisis we're in, but we take 5% as some kind of sacrosanct. It was not. It was created out of this movement by Wright Patman. He had asked for 10%. And of course, the more radical push was watered down, and initially a 6% payout rate was decided on, and then in subsequent tax reform, it was 5%. But you began to get this sort of sense that philanthropy has to pay attention to what donors want, and at the same time engage in transparency towards the public. And there's some very interesting moments during this time in the US. Henry Ford II left the Ford Foundation board, claiming that the Ford Foundation has become inimical to capitalism. At the same time, in the 1970s and 80s in the US, you saw the sudden rise of advocacy and conservative foundations. And indeed, you might draw a straight line to yesterday's decision in the US to add Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, to the efforts of the Olin Foundation and the Bradley Foundation to transform the American judiciary and the American legal profession. And so you began to see foundations move not to idea that they had in mid-century of working hand in hand with government as the sort of laboratory of democracy, but began to have foundations as alternative to governments, and indeed perhaps even disruptive of them. Lots of important developments in the recent years. You get things like Fidelity Charitable, created in 1991. 2000, the Gates Foundation formally becomes the Gates Foundation. Think about that. That's just 20 years. And yet it seems like it's been around forever. 2004, Pierre Omidyar created the first foundation as an LLC. And you began to get this talk about venture philanthropy and philanthropy as risk capital. And I think the interesting question in our current era of tech wealth philanthropy is, the tech wealth philanthropy has a very strong technocratic edge to it. You bet on a social entrepreneur, you give her the money to execute the donor's theory of change, and the nonprofit becomes, to a certain extent, a subcontractor for that vision. And when we're embarking on tackling a disease for which there is a cure, this is a really good model. It's worked quite successfully. But for things like poverty, racism, polarization, inequality, donor-approved philanthropy has, a lot of deep challenges that have provoked lots of questions of late. And we end the chapter thinking about, are we at a similar moment of transition? We've sketched through the chapter 5 eras of these different periods of philanthropy, and each one of them ends in a kind of crisis of legitimacy. And at that point, you sort of think, can you see in what's ending the threads of something new? And you have to also ask, what are the ways in which public opinion is responding to philanthropic efforts? And there are new debates in the US over perpetuity, the popularity of tech philanthropy. Certainly the rose has dropped off the bloom. And the Google antitrust suit is a really interesting example of where the spillover effects in the philanthropic world could be considerable. And I think one of the most interesting moments in recent months has actually come from Mackenzie Scott, a kind of mysterious, not well-known woman who was formerly married to Jeff Bezos. She's the wealthiest woman in the world. And quietly over the summer, she did something pretty remarkable. She gave away $1.7 billion of her money to 116 organizations. They're entirely unrestricted gifts. They go to groups that give them enormous flexibility. There are no grants to apply for, no multi-year metrics to hit, no pet projects. The group would need to, to respond to. Some people have just said, "Oh, this is a sea change." It's a huge shift in how philanthropy is done. As a donor, she acknowledged she doesn't have the answers, and the nonprofit should have them. And much of that money went to groups led by people of color, by women. Again, I stress the generosity of the gift. But as people have pointed out, less than a month after making those gifts, the value of her stock exceeded the amount of the gifts. And so, this, with the one hand, a pat on the back, with the other hand, deep questions about, is the money coming in faster than many people know what to do with it? That's the same issue that faced the Rockefellers and the Carnegies of the world at a time of considerable inequality at the turn of the century. And here, in the beginning of a new decade of 2020, these same questions appear. So that's our effort to kind of write a political history of philanthropy, to periodize it in terms of specific dates, and to think through the legitimacy challenges that the philanthropy faces, and to try in each period to show how the organizations that are the philanthropic entities, how they think, how they see the world, how they interpret problems, what their organizational routines are. So the chapter is a kind of combination of the sociology of knowledge and organizational sociology. So let me turn. That was a rapid run through 120 years. Certainly appreciate questions. But I want to reflect a little bit on another part of the book and turn to Maitreesh. Back in 1987, in the first edition of the handbook, my then junior colleague, Henry Hansman, who's an economist in the law school, was writing, I think, some very interesting work about nonprofits. The work was simple, powerful, I thought effective. It tried to make the distinction between nonprofits that were led by their managers versus nonprofits that were driven by their trustees. It thought a lot about the difference between nonprofits that relied on philanthropy or government support versus those that were entrepreneurial, that relied on fee for their services. And so we tried to sketch a bit the landscape of nonprofits. And at the core of what Hansman was doing was this idea that nonprofits emerge where you find market and government failures. They emerge in areas where the market won't offer an effective solution to consumers, or where governments have been unwilling to provide an optimal level of services. And Hansman argued that consumers are more trusting of nonprofits because of something he called the non-distribution constraint, a simple idea that the managers of a nonprofit at the end of the year, if there's money left over on the table, they wouldn't stick it in their pockets, as would happen in a for-profit firm, or they wouldn't immediately spend it down in the month of December in order to have their budget for the next operating year, as a government bureau would. And so this non-distribution constraint, he posited, and one of the things I had got to learn from Henry is, the beauty of economics is it creates models, and the models should talk back to you and tell you things. They are not necessarily close representations of the world, but you would like them to be. And so this idea of a non-distribution constraint became really powerful. But I think today, social purpose is by no means exclusive to nonprofit organizations. And there are a variety of different kinds of governance models that you see for various types of entities. In the for-profit world, we now have, B Corps. My favorite local one here in California is, of course, Patagonia, which, not only did they line up to become the first B Corp in California, but they routinely take out ads saying, "Don't buy new clothes. Come in and trade your old clothes. Come get your clothes fixed." Our local store is half a shop and half a Goodwill store. And then this past year, Patagonia says we will no longer make hoodies for tech companies because we don't want our name associated with tech companies. That's not your grandfather's for-profit firm. And so, how do we think about new governance models and new ways of thinking about nonprofits? And as Patricia and I looked around, it was clear that at the LSE, something's going on. There's people like Maitreesh Ghatak, there's Tim Besley, there's Nava Ashraf. There are a number of people trying to think much more broadly about social purpose. And so I'll turn to you, Maitreesh, to talk about your chapter.
Thank you, Woody. That was really wonderful to have an overview, because I remember when I first got interested in the field, among the few books I immediately got, and even though I'm working from home, I do have some of them here. So one was The Ownership of Enterprise, and by Huntsman, and then of course Woody's first edition as well as the second edition of the NonProfit Handbook. And I am happy to also show off the copy that arrived a few weeks ago with the mail delays and everything from a packet from LSE. So I now have the one that has that Woody just introduced. So I will, in a way, it's interesting to maybe share my journey into this area a little bit, because it sort of segues well with how Woody introduced the field. So I started off as a development economist, and and that's a broad field. In fact, I was just telling a student, what is development economics? I said it's every aspect of economics, say labor economics, public economics, but just applied to settings where institutions don't work very well. There are various frictions. So therefore, strictly speaking, development economics is everything, but applied in, you could be studying various aspects of economics, but within that sector, within that institution framework. So in the context of nonprofits, it's really, my interest in it was primarily empirical, because in developing countries from the 80s and 90s, NGO was a word that just, was becoming, extremely prevalent. So you go into social gatherings, somebody's working for the NGO, this NGO gets funded by that. And of course, there are the usual conspiracy theories of this is funded by, this government, this is funded by that, and whatever, that's their agenda, etc. So suddenly, as an economist who's interested in resource allocation, broadly speaking, I thought that if I just step out and take a bird's eye view of resources being allocated in economy, clearly there's the market sector, our national income measurement, all of that comes, largely from private goods that are produced for the market, etc. Then you have the government sector. Once again, this is very standard, and you don't just have to be an economist to see that these are the standard kind of classification, the public sector, the government, etc. But where do the NGOs fit in, right? And that essentially got me and Tim Besley start a conversation, which led to several papers and a research agenda that has, led to several papers and book that we are always planning to write. So, maybe this pandemic will finally create the whatever forced discipline for us to write it up. So we started thinking of the third sector, and then of course we stepped into the well-developed literature in the primarily in the West. And indeed, some of the things that and Woody was talking about, and that's where I kind of landed with reading up on nonprofits, with the work that I already mentioned, but that in addition, Weisbrod and whole range of people who have really thought hard about, what is this sector? What is it really doing within the economy, right? So that therefore, that's how I came to it. Now, let me, since I have some slides, so let me discuss a little bit what is the topic of social enterprise as economists see it. Of course, all of us know about it from various policy and media discussions, or perhaps even in some of our cases, direct involvement. So let me share the screen here. I would say that in terms of our broad thinking about nonprofits in the economy, essentially this was partly also reflecting something that was the debate about government failure, because we already knew that markets don't always work well. There are public goods, there are externalities. There is also a problem of poverty, inequality, discrimination, lots of things for which you can't just leave it to markets to allocate resources. So I think this would be, it's maybe leaving aside some extreme pockets. This was a broad consensus around the views. Of course, economists differed in terms of the instruments that would be needed or how to do these things. But the fact that there was a case to intervene there. But I would say that if you look at, again, the 80s, 90s, this was also the period where kind of socialism finally collapsed. So all across the world, there was kind of general skepticism. And, this may be to the West that was predates that. But even in developing countries, where I would say even, where growing up in India, even in the early to mid 80s, socialism was an alternative model. I mean, it's a serious one, not just to, people who were kind of, now perhaps would be considered more in the margins of, of mainstream discourse, but it was pretty much a solid model, right? So then, of course, that created this huge kind of skepticism about the role of government. And then also the factor that in the West also, there were, this is Reagan, this is Thatcher, this is the way of kind of privatization. This was a sense in which the public sector was kind of slow. It was kind of inefficient. It was a kind of absorber of resources, which was not quite showing up in terms of the social goals that it's supposed to serve. So in some ways, I would say that our focus on the third sector, or that it really started taking into account very seriously in economics, even mainstream economics, I think really started from that we could just see that empirically this was a sector that was growing in the US. In fact, the book has some specific stats in terms of percentage of US labor force that's in the nonprofit sector, percentage of GDP, etc. So it's non-trivial resource allocation that happens to this sector. And in addition, there were kind of conceptual or policy debates around the efficacy of the government to achieve certain social goals, and also for, starting with the position that markets are not very good in domains outside of kind of private goods and for consumers who are willing to pay. So, leaving that domain aside, they're not doing a great vehicle for resource allocation. So this was all good. So we realized that this is a sector that we should be studied. And indeed, as I said, that this is a more internal kind of view of how, I came to the topic, or how, say, economics profession, we sort of started taking this seriously. And Julian and others who have also kind of, had similar interests in the topic and have written on this. I'm sure we share some of the kind of broad, path through which now it is a fairly mainstream topic. But what's interesting, though, that if you wanted to fit it into standard economic framework, there was a problem. The problem is, what would an organization's goal be if it is not profit maximization? Well, we earlier had something called a planner or a government agency maximizing welfare. So I would say the entire public economics, I even, at the risk of kind of showing off too much of my home library collection here that I the books that I packed in before, after the pandemic kicked in. Atkinson Stiglitz, wonderful, public economics textbook. There's no discussion of the charitable, very little discussion on nonprofits, etc. It's all about optimal taxes, optimal ways of providing public goods, etc., etc. So the challenge was to fit this into an economic framework, the heart of which was a rational agent, who is typically viewed as kind of maximizing, right? And then the profit maximizing firm is an extension of this individual who, this is the organizational level extension of this individual motivation, that this will be maximizing profits. And of course, economists were not blind. Milton Friedman had his famous, New York Times op-ed called "The Social Purpose of Business is to Maximize Profits." And the premise there was, of course, that there are market failures and there are goods and services that are not allocated well by the market or certain social goals. But for that, either the government or a charitable sector exists. So therefore, it is like when you're playing, in a sports match. You're not there to show love and compassion to the fellow human being. You're playing a game of football and you're trying to score a goal, right? But the understanding is, once you step outside of the football field, presumably there's something called society, to paraphrase a famous saying. And in that society, there are certain sectors that would provide some of these goods and services. I do realize we have limited time, so I may not go through all the sort of formal slides I had presented, and I think some of you who were in a workshop a couple of weeks ago that was also organized by Marshall at least had seen some of this. So let me therefore follow a little bit of what Woody did and give a kind of verbal overview of what I do in this chapter. So I start off with Hansman, exactly because he and the first group of writing on nonprofits, it's important because it was basically trying to fit into an economics kind of framework where the heart of it is some kind of maximizing behavior on the part of individuals and organizations. How do you fit in nonprofits? Okay, and Hansman's kind of timing was great because the late 60s, when some of his papers, the Yale Law Review paper, is still one of the kind of really standard references, and then in the 70s, this was when information economics was on the rise. So therefore, Hansman's whole point become, yes, we know that firms would normally be maximizing profits, but what happens if the good or service that you're providing, the quality or even the quantity is not easy to observe? There are a whole class of goods and services. It's not like you buy a burger, eat a burger, pay for a burger, and you move on, right? There are goods such as experience goods. There are goods such as credence goods, where what is exactly that you had, like when you have a, say, something, a health intervention, often you don't even know. For it to be successful, nothing happens. All you are supposed to believe is because you had that intervention, your overall health, overall health quality would have improved and you would avoid certain illnesses, etc. So Hansman's starting point was, because there are basic problems of contractibility in these sections, that it's not like, what you see is what you buy and what you buy is, what you get, right? So there are all kinds of slips between the lip and the, service, good or service. Nonprofits was a credible commitment device on the part of an organization to kind of tie your hands behind your back, right? And say, hey, I'm not stealing money. You can donate to my organization. I'm selling it. You can have commercial as well as donative nonprofits. So if it's a commercial nonprofit, I'm even selling my service. It could be a school, it could be a hospital, but hey, I'm breaking even. And whatever residual earnings, which in a standard economic firm, you're supposed to maximize that. Here, it just will go into either directly the beneficiaries in the form of certain, payouts, or it'll go to some kind of a foundation, endowment, and that will be used for future purposes. But anybody who is concerned with decision-making of these organizations will not be pocketing any of the surplus earnings. And that means the managers, that means the kind of, board members, etc. When Woody approached me to write this chapter, I was really very happy because indeed, as I said, that this is a literature I really very organically as an economist and as a development economist, I walked in and had great interest in it. And therefore, to have a kind of modern take on this, since the work of Huntsman and several others that, basically focus on variations of this contract failure model. The research agenda, and this chapter reflects that Tim and I kind of took up and was basically trying to understand the whole range of organizational forms that were emerging that no longer could be just boxed into for-profits or non-profits. And social enterprise, of course, is one name, but there are various names. There are hybrid organizations whose one arm is a for-profit arm, and then the other arm, the non-profit arm, earns, kind of their stakeholders or actual equity holders of the for-profit arm, but it goes into charitable work. So there's a whole range of organizational form that was emerging. It was almost like in a curated garden, suddenly you open up the window and see there are all kinds of flora and fauna, and to easily compartmentalize them into either kind of standard for-profit firms or non-profit firms would be a stretch. So what we, and this is a open and active area of research, so therefore we only have, some initial work and ongoing work. What I think, if I have to summarize, and let me kind of go now, do take advantage of the slides because it does have that, summarize this kind of the literature here a little bit, that basically what you have is in the nonprofit problem, way of approaching things, it's very bang, bang, it's 0-1. Either you have for-profits, but then the trouble is those guys could be shading quality to make money, and therefore you cannot trust them on goods or services whose quality cannot be directly verified. So we understand that. Well, non-profits completely take away the profit motive, right? But then you have the problem that all the good reasons for which the profit motive leads to lower costs, overall efficiency, ability to attract equity capital, that all goes out of the window. So therefore, some of the criticisms of nonprofits would be similar to those of bureaucracies, for example, or any standard or non-business organization. They're not run very well, whether it's in the public sector or the nonprofit, right? So therefore, we thought that one way to think about this social enterprise and hybrid organizations it's a way of spanning this 0 and 1 kind of binary, that either you have like a full profit maximizing firm, etc., or you have kind of nonprofits that have kind of zero residual claimancy, and therefore, in a way, you're tying your hand behind your back and kind of not really doing anything to for private profits at the expense of quality or social welfare. And our main point is, therefore, just to summarize where we see this range of organizations, is there are equivalent of adding degrees of residual claimancy, because essentially what you have in a social enterprise is you are bypassing the strict enforcement of the non-distribution constraint, which also has tax advantages. In the case of the US, if you're a nonprofit, you're a 501k, I think that's the form that you fill in, and that gives you certain tax concessions. So these are ways of, in our view, first of all, relaxing certain financial constraints. Second of all, for certain goods and services, where that rigid cost quality trade-off is not so much of an issue, but more of a flexible cost quality trade-off is the issue. That you want to have some discretion as to where I'm gonna bypass or avoid the profit motive, but what are the routine things in which I can perfectly run it like a usual organization. So these are ways in which essentially introducing some of these dimensions, and indeed, therefore, what you can say is that sets an organizational goal in terms of what is maximized, what is prioritized. B, also it serves a selection role. Typically, for-profits would select in people who work in the for-profit sector who have a certain drive, certain view of society, certain ways in which they want to operate. Similarly, nonprofits are supposedly, supposed to draw in people who have a certain pro-social motivation, etc. And once again, what in our work that we kind of show is social enterprise might be more flexible ways of taking advantage of some of the advantages of a for-profit, of having kind of a better overall efficient management of the organization, as well as raising capital. But of course, nothing is free. So once you relax that, there was a reason Huntsman and the non-distribution constraint was the thing. How will you essentially enforce mission integrity? That becomes challenge, because otherwise, as we were joking, in fact, I still remember when I started working on NGOs, that there was a New Yorker cartoon, a typical of New Yorker cartoons, that there's a glum-looking guy applying for standing in front of a government office, and the government office is saying that, sorry, death squads do not qualify for the nonprofit status yet. Okay, so there's a sense in which what is it that you're doing, and how do we ensure that this is something that would be kind of consistent. Sorry, my phone is ringing, so I will just have to get rid of it. Sorry. So I would say, to wrap things up, I think that what we, in terms of this literature on social enterprise and social organizations, I think the research challenge is to think about the range of organizational form that exists. What are their role in creating the right incentives to essentially have accountability in terms of mission? Because otherwise you could just be making money and just using a different or fancy term for it. And finally, what are the ways in which it selects in the right kind of people? And the reason why economists focus a lot on that is because if you select in the right kind of people, certain monitoring or incentive issues become less of an issue. Because if you do indeed feel very motivated, mission committed folks, then your worry might be, I want them to actually pay more attention to cutting costs, because I'm kind of already okay in terms of them kind of being committed to the mission. Anyway, I think I have overstepped my time a little bit, so I will stop here and let's have some Q&A.
Thank you, Maitreesh. Thank you, Woody. So many fruitful avenues to talk about, from Mackenzie Scott through to how do you select in the kinds of people whom you might not worry about having propensity A, but then have to start worrying about having propensity B. We only have a few minutes, so I'm simply going to ask if people will unmute themselves and make their comments in as disorderly a way as possible, since I can't see everyone. Who would like to jump in with a comment or a question? Julian.
It was just an interesting question for Woody, which was what's the relationship between philanthropy and religion? And in particular, the destination of philanthropic funds in the United States. And how does that relate? And it's a topic that's recently come up of interest to us, which concerns ethnic giving, or giving by ethnic communities. Do you have any sort of interesting, is there patterns that are emerged there that?
Well, two things. One, in terms of pattern, the charitable giving in the United States is quite striking. As a percentage of income, the poor give more than anyone else, and the ultra rich are next. But giving by the poor is much more widespread. And so, as a quantitative in terms of number, it's more common, but it's in very small amounts, typically tithing to the church. And among ethnic groups, it's quite strong. Among African Americans, it's very strong. And so we see religious charitable giving by people with less income. And the important thing to then think about analytically is how much of that money goes into the general operation of the church for religious services, and how much goes for ancillary services. Churches, mosques, synagogues in the US do do not have to file these tax reports. But if they run a daycare, they run an elder care, then they do. And so you can get a sense of how much of their operations are actually funded by donations. Elite, high-end philanthropy, foundation philanthropy, ultra-rich philanthropy, very, very small fraction of it goes to religious organizations.
I was speaking to someone earlier on today who estimates the global zakat Muslim giving at around $1 trillion a year, which is significantly greater than people have previously estimated, and furthermore estimates that that it is increasing outside the country where the donation originates, and speculates that this might have something to do with growth in remittances. There's a question for Maitreesh from David. David, I don't know if you want to speak your question or if you want me to read it out.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, I'll read it out. It's for Maitreesh. You're talking about this non-profit profit conundrum. Do you think that's the root cause of the central government's mistrust of the sector?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a very, very good point. In fact, as we speak, in India, over the last few years, the current government, which is kind of somewhat right-wing in terms of its social and political views, there has been lots of tightenings on the third sector. So essentially now for, and that has really caused a whole range of organizations, from the Amnesty to more standard missionary type organizations that are working there. They work harder. And in general, I think the broad point that I think that is that, relates to your question. So clearly the government has a certain relationship with the for-profit sector, whether it's through taxes or through political donations, legit or non-legit, whatever. So that's a relatively kind of, that's kind of a certain ecosystem that is out there. But the non-profit sectors are neither here nor there, right? So at some level, they're doing things like health, education, and lots of things that they're seemingly competing with the government, right? Providing welfare. That's true even in the West, so therefore there's a sense of competitiveness, how come, they're so good? Why not the public sector, etc. And then depending on what kind of government you're dealing with, you may have ideological problems, because the whole thing is that the public good is never there are very few things other than maybe global warming, but even there are skeptics, I think, even now. But there are very few things on which there would be unanimous agreement on how it should be provided. We can all agree that there is something that the market underprovides, or something that is pollution that's going on too much. But whatever is the public good or service, how there is a certain ideology, certain kind of, because think about it, the mission, the word mission, where does the mission come from, right? So clearly there is a religious side to it, and therefore, an origin to it, right? And of course it can be a secular mission, whatever. But I think going back to David's question, therefore, both for the reasons of, not being able to extract too many resources from this sector, at least directly, that maybe corporations, it's easier to do. Number two, being somewhat kind of competitive players in providing similar types of things. And third could be these ideological reasons why, this could be going on. But very good question, thanks.
Thank you, Maitreesh.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I know this conversation, there are so many different threads that I would like to unpick and follow, but we've run out of time. So what I'm going to do is thank everyone for being here. Thank Maitreesh for his contribution, and give the last word to Woody, prefaced only by saying thank you. And we will use this book in our research and in our teaching. And to give you the last word, Woody.
Oh, well, thank you, Stefan. And I'll just simply say, I hope the book is in fact the legacy for everyone to take advantage of. On this very topic that David just asked a question about, there are at least 3 different chapters that talk about government restriction on nonprofits and why it's growing, not just in India or China, but Canada, for example, restricts foreign funded environmental organizations, because they're considered rivalrous to the forestry industry in Canada. So I think what you see with the volume is a new and fresh take on the role of nonprofits, and Maitreesh's presentation, I think, did a really nice job of illustrating that. So appreciate your doing this, and cheers and carry on, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are.
Yeah.
Thank you, Woody. Thank you, Maitreesh.